Welcome back to History Class with Dr. W. In this lecture, we conclude our discussion of the American Revolution, thinking about the meanings of the war and what it meant for various groups of Americans. In this final lecture about the Revolution, we're going to think about what the Revolution meant for Native Americans and most importantly for the states and the Union itself in the aftermath of the war. Let's think about the impact of the Revolutionary War on the Indians. It's first worth considering what side might you suppose the Indians would have fought with during this war. So if we think back to the build-up to the war and what happened before, it was the British who had set up the proclamation line to protect the Indians from the settlers, or at least to keep the settlers from expanding into Indian territory. So most Indians viewed this as a sign that the British were on their side, and so most of them fought with the British during this war. And unfortunately, of course, for them, that proved to be the losing side. If you think back to the French and Indian War, most of the Indians fought on the side of the French in that war and also lost. So they have a really unfortunate track record in these early American conflicts. As a result of this defeat, the coastal tribes are more or less eliminated by this time. And the important tribes between the Appalachian Mountains and the Mississippi, foremost among them the Iroquois Confederacy, also suffer greatly during this period. The Iroquois Confederacy predominates in the Ohio River Valley, and the five major tribes of the South, the Creek, Seminole, Cherokee, Choctaw, and Chickasaw, all suffer greatly during and after the war, and about 75,000 Indians remained by the end of the war. During the war itself, Indians made sporadic raids against American towns and cities throughout the war, but retaliation against them was harsh. In 1776, for instance, Thomas Jefferson said, "I hope that the Cherokees will now be driven beyond the Mississippi." The Iroquois Confederacy, after being attacked by Americans in several instances, actively joined the British side, and between 1777 and 1779, as I discussed in the previous lectures, enjoyed a string of victories along with the British against the Americans. The fighting was brutal at times, and retaliation when the momentum in the war turned was very harsh. At times there are instances of colonial forces killing men, women, and children, burning fields of corn, burning down villages, and other atrocities. A saying of that era was civilization or death to all American savages. By the time of the end of the war, the Iroquois had lost about a third of its population and most of its land. And in the aftermath of the war, much as we discussed with some of the freed slaves, the Indians now had to live with the reality that they had been defeated. The colonists, in some cases, believed that Native Americans could be civilized, meaning Christianized or Americanized, learn the language, learn the customs of the white man. And some of them do, a process that we're going to be discussing in future lectures. But generally after the war, the Indians were treated as a conquered enemy. In some cases, they were forced to sign treaties, ceding their lands to the colonists. Some of those treaties were honored, others of them were not over time, and other groups were still less fortunate, forced off of their land or, in some cases, murdered. So the Revolutionary War had perhaps the most grave and serious consequences for the Indians. So as we've discussed, the idea that all men are created equal excluded blacks, even those slaves who had been freed, excluded women, excluded Native Americans, excluded many others. But let's think a little bit more about what equality did mean, even for white men in this era. Because obviously, all men are not created equal. Even if you physically just observe, there are large and small, tall and short, intelligent and not so intelligent, and so on. So it seems perhaps folly to say that all men are created equal. But the founders didn't mean exact equality in that sense. What they meant was, on the one hand, equality of opportunity. All men have the chance to reach the same heights, regardless of their origins. And second, this is a reference to equality before the eyes of God. Regardless of whatever superficial differences there might be between one man and another, in our hearts and souls we are all equal as men, and we will all face the judgment of God equally. The reality, though, is that equality remains a myth for many. The poor, the uneducated, certain immigrant groups, other minorities will find at that time and throughout much of our history that even equal opportunity was not available to them. And yet, we have to note that as the new government is established, which we'll be talking about in the next chapter, democracy in these new United States is more broadly extended than pretty much anywhere else in the world. This is the idea of broad franchise, the extension of voting rights to more and more citizens than what we see anywhere else. But of course, that still comes at that time with many, many limitations in what is to become the new nation. And finally, we need to think about what the revolution meant for this new nation that was to become the United States. If you look at the dollar bill, you see the phrase e pluribus unum, from many, one. That has a number of different meanings in our history, but for our purposes, as we think about the birth of this new nation, we might think about from many colonies, one nation. I think it's easy for us to assume, and those who don't know the history of this period in particular, to assume that there was a revolution and then there was the United States, and everything just sort of happened organically. But that's not the case at all. Even in the aftermath of the revolution, the states really considered themselves independent and separate. There was, for instance, some question whether George Washington would even step down as commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. When he surrendered his sword to the Confederation government, it was something of a surprise. Something like that had really never happened before. Consider that in the aftermath of the Revolution, France sent 13 different ambassadors to the United States, one for each state. And as John Adams described it, the Revolution had been 13 clocks, all striking midnight at the same time. They really viewed themselves as independent states, much more than they viewed themselves as one United States. We're going to be talking about currency in just a moment, but currency was an issue. The governance by the Continental Congress, which was a weak confederation government, was an issue. We're going to talk more about that in the next chapter. And so really, if this is to become one nation, it is pulled apart at the seams by all manner of divisive issues. Localism versus nationalism. Far more people living in the states during this period thought about things in local terms. It was still relatively unusual for people to travel up and down between the states. Most of their lives and their attention was focused just on their local town, maybe their state. But few people really thought about a nation pulled together. There's tension between the state governments and the national government, as again we will discuss in the next chapter. There's tension between the large states and the small states. And as you can see on this map, some of the states are huge and control huge tracts of land compared to some of the smaller ones. Related to that is a phenomenon of landed states versus landless. A number of states, like you see the Carolinas here and Virginia, Georgia, stretching out to the west, there really was no well-defined western boundary of those states. They extended out in theory all the way across the continent. Meantime, other states locked along the eastern seaboard have no room to expand into. That's going to create problems. And then, of course, and probably most noteworthy, are the differences and divisions between North and South, which are born long before the Revolution itself, but of course will erupt later in the Civil War. So with so much pulling us apart, how is it then that these individual states ultimately come together as one nation? What things do bring us together? Language? No, not really. There was a great diversity of language and dialects throughout the states. And it's only in the 1780s that Noah Webster pulled together the first dictionary of American English, in part trying to bring the nation together. Territory? Well, again, no. The nation was huge, among the largest in the world even at that time. And yet settlements were scattered and small for the most part. Localism was the key. In 1790, there were 4 million Americans, about 95% of which lived in towns of fewer than 2,500 people. Communication? No, communication was frustratingly slow at that time. A letter could travel from Boston to England and back to Philadelphia faster than it could travel overland, straight from Boston to Philadelphia. As we'll discuss later, it took several months for George Washington to receive news of his election, prepare for his journey, and then make his way to become the first president. Religion? Again, no. There's great diversity in religion throughout the country, dozens of different sects. Traditions? Not really. Some of those would be born over time, but even the 4th of July isn't celebrated until later. And currency? Well, you've picked up on the theme here. Currency doesn't bring us together either. Each colony had its own currency, and even the continental currency, which you see pictured on the screen, the currency of the Revolution itself, is ultimately rendered worthless. So what then does finally bring us together as a nation? As one British travel writer asked in 1782, what then is the American, this new man? Well, much of what defines us comes to be an American sort of mythology or ideology. The ideal of equality and uniformity, those ideas that I talked about associated with the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, even if they are not honored perfectly, become a unifying force. The ideal of the self-made man, going back to the idea of the Puritan work ethic and so on. The ideal of the melting pot, that all immigrants can come in and sort of become one with each other. The ideal of rugged individualism, conquering the frontier, and the various myths associated with it. So a lot of these ideals that bring us together in the era after the Revolution are proven to be myth. They aren't really honored so much as they are these ideas. But even in this sort of mythological state, they help to unify Americans, help to bring us together under one common system of beliefs and ideals. In the next series of lectures, we will talk about how truly a government is born, bringing together these disparate states into one nation, the United States.